Welcome to the Sheth Leadership Academy Lecture Series, a series of lectures delivered by Professor Jagdish Sheth, one of the top thinkers in consumer behavior and globalization, and the author of books such as Chindia Rising and The Four Aids of Marketing. I hope you enjoy this lecture on how to become a globally integrated enterprise.
As the world is globalizing, both sets of multinationals are struggling to come out with an organizational design that will be appropriate for the future. You have the traditional advanced country, highly industrialized nations such as United States, Germany, France, Japan, etc., whose enterprises began some time ago, definitely growing post-World War II, and had organized themselves in a way that was appropriate for their own time, such as creating country-by-country subsidiaries or regional headquarters, because that was mandatory quite often by law, or quite often it was required in the way you did business. Or you have, on the other hand, emerging multinationals from emerging economies, especially from countries like China, India, Mexico, Brazil, any one of these countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, where the local business groups are aspiring or have no choice to become global, and they don't know what's the right organizational design. So both are struggling, one because of a lot of experience, how to undo what they did, and the other one, of course, lack of any experience. So this lecture tries to look into that and make a recommendation about a 7-point process that if you're serious about becoming a globally integrated enterprise to compete in a world market as opposed to multi-domestic markets, maybe these 7 points will be of help to you. So let's start the journey by looking at the traditional way of analyzing why the world is globalizing. There are 4 main reasons, like anything else. The biggest reason is actually trade for global growth. With aging of the advanced nations, after the first energy crisis in 74-78, most of the advanced countries decided that the best way to grow is not domestic GDP, because it was not happening with the aging of the population. Also, there was a huge outsourcing, especially of manufacturing activities, because advanced countries did not have enough manpower, their costs were rising. There was a creation of the regional trading blocs such as the NAFTA, the European Union, the ASEAN bloc, the Andean, Mercosur, etc., all over the world. Even Africa has its own economic trade union, which all necessitated that the traditional approach to trade is not likely to work, that what we need to do is to abandon the old trade policies, which is called GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, replaced with a new regime called WTO, World Trade Organization, encourage more trade within the regions you have created and between the nations in the world. Also, bilateral trade agreements began to grow, so trade became a growth engine, which means that the protectionism given from imports was basically reduced as much as possible, whether it's a tariff or just access to the market. So this has globalized the world faster than we thought was possible. And I think in an outsourcing environment, most of the trade that has grown is within what we call intra-firm, within the company trade. So a company makes one component in one part of the world, another component another part of the world, assembles in a third part, markets in a fourth place, and therefore it has a constant import-export implications, which is trade. I remember working at Motorola as an advisor in the semiconductor industry, where they told me a typical semiconductor travels 4 countries worldwide: Schaumburg, Illinois, to, for example, East Kilbride in Scotland, someplace, to in France, Toulouse, France. My memory, I had gone there, to Malaysia, someplace in Asia, before that semiconductor is fully ready to be sold and shipped out to a customer, such as a RISC chip that went into Apple computers and other chips. It was very fascinating. So every time you have the same raw material or a component go out for further finishing, it is counted as an export. It comes back as a more finished, it counts as an import. And so this is really not the trade in the traditional sense we knew, but this is within company, within enterprise trade. And the total trade, that it has grown as a percent of the total trade, is now about 25 to maybe even 30%. We also now have outsourcing of services, like IT services, for example, or R&D centers, or accounting services. Professional law firms are all doing it So trade has become a key factor. We also see globalization happening because of growth of emerging markets, where countries where at one time people thought, I just cannot afford to enter because of all the risks involved, today find it's absolutely necessity for them. It is not a question of whether I should do business or not. It's a question of figuring out how to do business. And that's what's happening with all the emerging economies, especially China, especially India, some parts of Africa, and maybe some parts of Latin America. So the growth of the emerging markets, which itself is arising because of the growing brand conscious middle class, and because of the transition from the agriculture society, where most of the things are made locally, made by the consumer themselves, make versus buy, they do all the value add themselves, or in fact unbranded products are bought and consumed. How do you make the into an organized industrial society with economies of scale, consistency, reliability of products, and create a new growth? So this has generated additional globalization phenomenon. The third one is market-oriented policy reforms. Most of the ex-colonies did not believe in the traditional capitalism of the Western world, so they tended to be slightly socialistic in their orientation, and they wanted to make sure that the markets they had now as independent nations is not dominated by foreign multinationals. So they put all the policy restrictions. Unfortunately, it did not create an economic miracle. Happened with the Soviet Union after World War II, the creation of an enlarged what is called Comecon economy, which means within the bloc you make products, let's say in Hungary, a bus for public transportation, and you sell it everywhere, including Russia, which is a large market within the Soviet bloc. And you make aircraft some other place, a military aircraft, and sell it to some other place within the bloc, like a within company, in this case within region trade, but controlled from outside influences. And this happened with nuclear weapons, it happened with energy. If you look at the ex-Soviet Union countries, you will see high degree of specialization by each of the nations, then having access to a much larger market, but in a closed economy. I think that did not sustain very well. And of course, the most famous transition from communism to capitalism has been China, which has become totally transformative. In 30 years, it has accomplished what most nations not been able to achieve in 100 years, for example. And this is continuing in Africa, it is continuing in Central America, and I think that's the third major force. The fourth one is, again, they're all interdependent, is repositioning of large domestic business groups or conglomerates. At one time, since the markets were captive, you actually ended up acquiring or creating more businesses within the country. So you see the Tata Group in India, not only in the steel business where they began, but gets into the automobile business, gets into, in fact, consumer business, gets into tea business, all domestic. Similarly, Birla Group in India. Same thing true about the state-owned enterprises in China, primarily domestic focus. And now, as the domestic markets are getting liberalized, opened up for foreign competition, they have to compete internationally by going to where the competition is, as well as expand the market as they lose the share or 100% monopoly in the domestic market. While the market may be growing, the share declines, so you counterbalance by going abroad. So many of these emerging market domestic conglomerates, whether it's a Grupo Bimbo out of Mexico, for example, or whether it's a SAB, South African Brewing Company, or InBev, which is basically a Brazilian company based in Belgium, or Tata Group, or Chinese state enterprises, all of them are now becoming global enterprises, aspiring to be a global player rather than a domestic player. Which leads to the other propositions. In one of my earlier books, I've written about the way competition organizes an industry called the rule of three. As the industry evolves, there are hundreds, if not thousands of people who jump into the industry. There is a shakeout merger, and ultimately through rationalization, industry ends up having three big full-line generalists and lots of niche players, and somebody who has neither the scale or a volume advantage nor the margin advantage collapses. So only three are big survivors. This domestic rule of three with globalization is now becoming global rule of three. And since most economy as of 1987 was dominated by the old triad power, which is Western Europe, 12 common market countries, usual suspects respects, Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, and England or UK, and of course US, Canada, and Japan. These are the 15, 16 nations. And their multinationals invested into each other economies, they had their own subsidiaries, etc., and expanded within that. So we had now US companies competing in Japan, Japanese companies competing in Europe, European companies competing in both places, etc. And when the industry becomes global, there is no room for 3 American players, 3 Japanese players, 3 European players. It becomes rule of 3 on a global basis. There is only room for 3 players on a global basis. So there are 9 companies otherwise, sometimes 10 in Europe if you count UK as a part of continental Europe, for example. So global rule of 3, as you can see in the slide. I saw this and witnessed it and participated in the emergence of global rule of 3 in the passenger tire business. Michelin used to be primarily European, but they came to North America, put enormous pressure. The third largest company, BF Goodrich, collapsed. The Japanese also came to America in the 80s because their OEM automobile makers were all here, Honda, Toyota, Nissan, and they were their suppliers. So Bridgestone came. With a dual pressure, all of the major American tire makers couldn't survive. So BF Goodrich goes out of business, merges with Uniroyal, I think. Together they couldn't survive. They sold everything to brand names to Bridgestone, to Michelin. Firestone, second largest company, struggles to survive, and obviously they could not go to the radial tires, which is how Michelin came in, sold it to Bridgestone, and the only survivor there for US has been Goodyear, American company Goodyear, the Japanese is Bridgestone, and Michelin from Europe. So there Pirelli collapses, for example, Dunlop collapses, Continental barely survives, which is a big player but sort of specialized in some fashion. So you see the rule of 3, Michelin number 1, Bridgestone number 2, Goodyear number 3. This is uncanny, absolutely predictable, happens inevitably. Therefore, if you are a merger acquisition player, you know how to position yourself as an investment banker, for example. I see this happening now in the automobile sector. There is no room for so many European car makers, so many Japanese car makers. Of course, in the US, we have rationalized to only big 3 essentially. Even the specialty guys like Checker, which made yellow cabs, that's gone. Studebaker went some time ago. American Motors collapsed. So we have GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Chrysler is, as you know, now owned by Fiat. You have Toyota, Nissan, and Honda out of Japan. You have a Renault, Peugeot, Daimler, Chrysler, which is now actually Daimler-Benz back again, BMW, Volkswagen, Fiat. There are just too many European players, is my view, and you will see an enormous global rationalization, and forecast is that Toyota will remain number 1, but number 2 out of nowhere will be Volkswagen. This was not even thinkable 10 years ago. A specialty niche company making people's car, primarily meant very affordable entry-level price, becoming a dominant full-line car makers. But the strategy has been very, very interesting actually, and quite inspiring in the way they have done it, with the Audi brand on the luxury side, expanding the Volkswagen capacity in terms of different size models, almost entering into family sedan business, etc., and having a global footprint. Of course, they went to China before most of the people, which have given them a huge advantage, as China has become the second largest market in the world for automobiles. The third one is likely to be Ford, but with a question mark. It doesn't have a global footprint. But the way it is behaving recently, it has a better chance than, let's say, General Motors or Renault Nissan, which is a combination of Renault partly owning Nissan and then having some sort of a joint management. So we will see clearly as an example. In aircraft manufacturing, we used to have Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and Lockheed. Lockheed collapsed with a price war between McDonnell Douglas and Boeing. McDonnell Douglas is gone, it's owned by Boeing. Airbus came as a competitor out of European consortium. There is a vacuum. In a rule of 3, if there are only 2 major players worldwide, there is always a room for a third player. People have asked me this question about soft drinks industry. In soft drinks industry or consumer packaged goods, it is not at a company level, but it is at a brand level. So you have the Coca-Cola brand Coke, you have the Diet Coke, and Pepsi, for example. Rule of 3 prevails. So there may be room for niche players unless, let's say, Pepsi somehow doesn't do a good job being a globally integrated enterprise, although they are, I think so. So that's clearly what happens. And there's always an opportunity for an emerging market multinational to become number 3 player, as we see in the IT services, where you have the IBM, you have the Accenture, but number 3 is a race, and we think Tata Consultancy Services, TCS, is very likely to end up being number 3 global player. In the airline industry, because it is still owned and operated by governments quite a lot, there is government ownership and even management. There are restrictions about how much a foreigner can own the airline of a sovereign state. Given that, airline industry has learned to create alliances, and in alliances you do operational code sharing, you price rationalize, etc. And given that, you basically lock them into a virtual joint ventures. So when the governments allow the freedom, it is easy to buy and sell or divest and invest kind of a stuff. And we see clearly among hundreds of airlines, especially in these 3 mature markets, you see a alliances formed, which is a Star Alliance number 1, One World number 2, SkyTeam number 3. Now, this is all prior to the rise of emerging economies. So all of a sudden, the whole thing can get disrupted by, for example, Etihad Airways, or by Emirates, or by Qatar, all 3 Gulf country airlines, and then become the dominant player in the world, and most of these have to collapse. Remember, there's only room for 3 players. And therefore, the global evolution of a company, which used to be a very slow, predictable pattern. You began as a domestic company, you exported into certain markets where there was a patronage or a franchise for your brand, the technology and the product, especially in a B2B environment, business to business, like machines, for example. Now they're saying, why are you exporting from your country? Can you make it locally? Maybe the shipping costs are high. Maybe you have to localize the technology because of the rules, regulations about safety, whatever reason is. So typical, a good domestic company becomes multi-domestic, which means has a subsidiary and a presence in some other country as a fully owned subsidiary or a company. And then multi-domestic company eventually begins to destroy the multi-domestic architecture, which is regional, into a global architecture. That's a transition. But nowadays, that's just too slow a process. So you become a globally integrated enterprise as soon as you start as a domestic company. All the new age companies you see think global upfront, whether it's a Microsoft or a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter. I mean, any one of these things is so different than their counterparts either in the media companies or the IBMs of the world, which began with the previous way of doing it. So that's what it is. So how do you become an integrated global enterprise? And why should you become one? The main reason is that it gives you efficiency and it gives you some form of a balancing global versus local elements on a worldwide basis. So here are the 7 different ways a company can become integrated global enterprise. So this is a benchmarking, and one can then assess themselves, do an audit to say how far are we on this journey. The first major ingredient is global orientation of the culture, the management, the people, everybody. I tell you, I have worked for companies in the US, in the Midwest, great culture, I love them. They have been good learning experiences for me, but they never had any global orientation. They never designed products from a global market perspective. I was amused to find out that many of the managers did not have a passport even to travel. I'm talking about all the way to mid-80s time framework. They never had to travel abroad. Many of them thought Visa was a credit card. Isn't that interesting? Think about it. These are well-educated people, but they never had the need or the opportunity to travel abroad, except maybe for family vacations, which obviously was not the case. Otherwise, they would have passport. Very interesting. I was absolutely surprised because I came from the opposite background and the orientation. So global orientation means, is your technology from a global perspective? Is your branding, whether it's a corporate brand or a product brand, from a global market perspective? Is your policy, geopolitical policy, from a global geopolitics, for example? You know, you had the old triad power of Japan, Western Europe and America, but the new triad power now is China, India, and United States, and it's changing the geopolitics enormously. Well, do you understand that? Do you know where the world, sort of the geopolitics are going? Because they either can close the markets, open the markets, etc., etc. That's what I'm talking about. Second major area is, how do you create an integrated enterprise even though you are global, where people, processes, and infrastructure look like it's one organization, as opposed to a federation of organizations, where the corporate headquarters headquarters is more like a holding company or a federation. You have all these fiefdoms, which are product fiefdoms or country fiefdoms, especially geographic fiefdoms, or sometimes in fact they are client or customer fiefdoms. But this says basically you are creating a architecture where the whole enterprise behaves as if it's a one enterprise worldwide, with all of the adjustments and adaptations that you can have to make to localize yourself. That's very key. So people are no longer from one country of origin. In fact, I find that every manager from every country of origin has his own blinders or stereotypes. We always criticize Americans having stereotypes, but I find Germans have their own stereotypes, Indians have their own stereotypes, Chinese have their own stereotypes, and the only way to remove the stereotypes is to make them mobile and make them travel and make them live and manage customers and markets and products worldwide. Make them learn foreign languages. And most companies are trying to create that more and more as a career pathing of senior leadership team. Our practices, it's much easier today with the, let's say, enterprise resource planning systems, ERPs, such as SAP or Oracle. I can put a global architecture. In other words, IT technology has provided much greater possibility, and now with the World Wide Web phenomenon, the internet and the cloud computing, I think this is going to happen much sooner, that I can create one integrated enterprise. And the last one is infrastructure, which means physical infrastructure. You're talking about enabling infrastructure. You're talking about supply chain infrastructure, etc. So the second thing is, how do you now put together, you must put together an integrated enterprise. The third area, and I think most companies have not paid enough attention, is to have access to global capital. Most companies get listed in one stock exchange, usually the home turf advantage. If I'm an American company, I'm listed in New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. If I'm an Indian company, I'm listed in Bombay Stock Exchange or National Stock Exchange. If I'm a Japanese company, I'm in Tokyo Stock Exchange. If I'm a Chinese company, I'm in Hong Kong Stock Exchange, Shanghai Stock Exchange. If you are a British company, you are in London Stock Exchange. If you are a German, it just goes on and on, same thing. The new idea says that you must be in multiple stock exchanges at the same time, not as what we call, the ADRs, which are really basically a reflection of the premium that you command and access to capital traded separately. We are talking about simultaneously being in half a dozen world stock markets. How do you do that? The CFO in the organization, Chief Financial Officer, has to have that vision, has to have that globally integrated enterprise mindset, and I have not seen in many companies. I'm absolutely surprised that they never thought of listing in multiple stock exchanges at once. I think it may happen a little more with the new age companies. They might be able to do that thing, but this is very important. Also, private equity is worldwide. It is no longer just domestic private equity. And all of the large private equity players are worldwide, whether it's Goldman Sachs on the one hand, even Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's private equity firm, Blackstone, for example, KKR, and they have generated capital from their investors, not from one country, but many countries. Next phase, of course, is the sovereign funds. The sovereign funds are becoming so massive now, and they are basically having global orientation. Rather than saying we have a sovereign fund which will only allow people who want to invest in our nation, that we will help them and invest in there, an equity of some sort or a debt kind of a thing. Today, sovereign funds are saying, if you're a global player, I would like to play with you globally. Very different way of thinking. And the last one, and a very critical one, is that how do I get access to low-cost debt? Debt is pretty oppressive, especially for an emerging country multinational, because your risks are high in their mind. So how do you have access to very low cost of capital to service the debt, either on the equity or the debt? But debt is the one that I want to focus primarily. That basically says that you must have understanding and reach of global capital. Next area is global partnering. Doing business worldwide requires partnering with your suppliers and partnering with your customers. In professional services, clients often actually motivate you to go global, to follow them. Similarly, you as a major buyer motivate your suppliers. In automotive, that's very common, as it is in let's say aerospace industry, any metal bending, as it is in appliances, for example. So you basically have an ecosystem that has to be present on a global basis. And then you also have competitors and joint ventures that may be also on a global basis. So how do you partner with some people on a global basis rather than a local basis as it used to be? So this is a third major thing a company has to do. The fourth one is very key. The way you design the organization, it has to have both flexibility and speed. The flexibility is because of the geopolitical dynamics. It's moving so rapidly. You have no idea how two nations are in favor with each other. They are liking each other. They are friends, and suddenly they become foes. Egypt and United States. We have gone through that. Great partnerships suddenly changes for whatever reason. On the other hand, some countries that United States was not even friends have become friends now. This change is so rapid, happening almost on an annual basis, not even 4 or 5 year cycle, which means that you as an organization and the industry you belong to will be affected by the geopolitics of the world. And therefore, how do you create an organization that is capable of adjusting, adapting to that external pressure? You also find that opportunities are not planned quite often. So how do you have an opportunistic behavior? Which means if there is an opportunity, Myanmar is immediately in my mind as I tape this lecture. Myanmar has opened up. It's like a gold rush for everybody now. Now you can't think about Myanmar, should I take a risk or not? Should I go now or later? You gotta jump into it or you don't jump into it. Very interesting. So many companies are going to Myanmar despite poor infrastructure, despite in fact the old belief that an ex-military country can never become an economic capitalistic society, etc. People are jumping into that one. And a third one is a flexibility and speed in your operations and management, which means deploying your operations such as supply chain, such as downstreaming logistics, or your management team and talent. Can you scramble? This is more like, do you have the capability of scrambling also, not just making big plays as we call it in the American football. Next category, equally important if you want to be truly globally integrated enterprise, is that your innovation ought to be global in its scope and in its orientation. So we have seen General Electric and Boeing having global R&D centers, global supplier partners who are your technology partners. The Boeing Dreamliner was designed and implemented by hundreds of partners and vendors, had a global footprint. Why this is important? It's very important because each country, and I would go down to at each university, and sometimes a professor within a university has a specific approach towards science and engineering. Great approach, but it's not the only approach. In fact, we can just simply look at it. You have the German tradition of science, you have the Russian tradition of science, you have the American tradition of science, you have the British tradition of science, which is different than, let's say, Indian tradition of science. How do you create these different ways of looking at the same problem or solutions and leverage that? Talent is there, but they were trained differently to think differently. How you can harness all that by creating global innovation centers where they are basically mini United Nations. And today you don't have to have physical centers. These are basically virtual scientific teams. Microsoft and Google have already done the same thing, that they are now expanding worldwide and having their R&D as well as product teams located all over the world. Toyota has done a great job, my view, and Samsung is just about getting into thinking of innovation on a global basis, having multiple talents all over the world contribute towards Samsung rather than just South Korean scientists and engineers. And the last element, nothing works in business without a direct alignment between the organization and its reward system. So reward for globalization is very key. So you reward managers who are able to execute a global orientation, a globally integrated enterprise in whatever they do, and do not reward as well those who are unable or unwilling to do it. So at 3M company, great company, when they got a new CEO, Jake Jacobson was his name, he looked at the data and he simply said, my God, all the revenue we earn is from markets and products that are older than 5 or 10 years, whatever the number was. And my God, we really don't have innovation. Here is a company that prides on being innovative, but there are no major breakthroughs since post-it days, essentially. Shakes up the organization by challenging each of the business units that are highly decentralized P&L by product groups and market groups, saying that you must generate 20 to 25% incremental revenue from markets that didn't exist 5 years ago and from products and technologies that didn't exist 5-10 years ago. All of a sudden, 3M company becomes innovative in places that they had never thought of and goes after markets they had never thought of, clearly globalizing the company. Coca-Cola has done the same thing. Of course, it is probably lead organization toward that one. And here is a company whose CEO is not necessarily an American, for example, which is the ultimate sign that you are a truly globally integrated organization, where you lose the country of origin identity in your management team, in your culture, pretty much. And I'm told both Lenovo, which is the PC maker, as well as into other things they do in the PC world, and Huawei Technologies, which is primarily telecom infrastructure, but they also do other things, are both pretty much encouraged by their own state enterprise governments to go global, think global, reward people for globalization. So that's the main thing. So let me just summarize this lecture by saying that liberalization of international trade through regional integrations as well as bilateral trade agreements is a major driver of globalization. Globalization is also accelerating as companies break up domestic conglomerates through spin-offs and divestments, and we have seen quite a lot of that recently. Finally, growth of emerging markets and emergence of market-oriented economic policies and reforms is also increasing globalization of markets and competition. As markets and competition become global, companies must transform themselves from domestic and multi-domestic companies into truly globally integrated enterprises. To become globally integrated enterprise will require global orientation. First of all, mindset is alone very important. Reorganizing into globally integrated enterprise through people, processes, and infrastructure. Access to global capital markets. Learn how to do global partnering. Have flexibility or agility and speed in the organization. Think innovation from a global perspective and reward your management from becoming domestic to global in their orientation. So reward for globalization. I just want to make a comment here that for a greenfield company altogether, it is much easier. Most companies, once they become successful, still tend to remain very ethnocentric. And I've recommended in some companies that the best way to make them global is to relocate their corporate headquarters, where the country of origin bias suddenly goes away. And then have your people think like the diplomatic corps, where every diplomatic corps person in foreign affairs ministry learns to live abroad for 2-3 years, not just to visit, local language, customs, and represent the nation in a positive way. I think same thing can happen with enterprises. We can learn quite a lot from the military and learn quite a lot from the diplomatic corps of nations about how to create a global orientation as well as provide a reward and recognition for truly globalization. To me, this is not just a nice thing to do anymore, but is becoming more and more necessity.
Thanks for listening to How to Become a Globally Integrated Enterprise with Professor Jagdish Sheth. For more about Professor Sheth and the Sheth Leadership Academy, visit www.shethleadershipacademy.com.